We're 3 months into the process of the journey towards resilience-based management at Ningaloo, and just about to start a resilience assessment, as Amy's just described. I think we can really share some early lessons and experiences from the interface between the ecological and the social spheres, and how that's being received and sort of conceptualised by the community as we're talking about these sort of concepts. I'd like to reiterate the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this country that we're meeting on today, but also the traditional custodians of the land that we manage at Ningaloo, so the Bayungu, the Talangi and Yinagudara people. We have a really close working relationship with the TOs in Ningaloo, and it's really interesting to chat with them about resilience, because it's fascinating for me that these very new kind of novel and leading edge approaches to management from our perspective really come back and circle back to those traditional concepts of healthy people, healthy country, as Roger was talking about this morning. This is where Ningaloo is. I'm sure some of you have a really good experience with Ningaloo, or a really good knowledge of Ningaloo, but some in the room might not. So we're up in the little tip that you can see up in the middle part of Western Australia. Long way from most of the regional centres. 300 kilometres or almost 300 kilometres of fringing reef that extends along a coastline that's partially national park and partially pastoral lease. It's been recognised in terms of its outstanding universal values as a World Heritage Area, both for its exceptional natural beauty and the unique biodiversity in the region. So, I mean, we have a huge diversity of coral species. We have large megafauna like whale sharks, humpbacks, turtles, manta rays that really support the tourism that moves through that region. And we also have a strong terrestrial component that links to that marine component and forms part of that exceptional natural beauty that it's been recognised for. When I say fringing reef, it really is fringing. We're talking about walking off the beach and onto coral. This is one of the largest developments on that coastline. So we have very little in terms of development along that coastal area, but accessibility is very high. And it means that accessibility poses a challenge for management in terms of visitation and user impacts. And that visitation is not decreasing, so we're seeing large increases in visitation by any metric that you look at. So this is a key management challenge for us, both in terms of tourist numbers, camping numbers, visitation to the national parks. In some ways that's done well and is highly managed, particularly up the northern end of the park, and we can see the benefits that having the tightly managed national parks brings in terms of the way that camping is managed. In other areas down the southern parts, in those ex-pastoral leases, there's less control, and we're seeing a lot more interaction between visitors and those iconic marine species, and not always appropriate interactions and things that take up a lot of management time. In terms of the projections for Ningaloo, we're actually on the better end of the spectrum, but we're all seeing within 20 years that we will be experiencing mass bleaching twice per decade intervals beyond the recovery potential of the reef. So we are facing a situation where the children being born today are potentially the last generation to see healthy coral reefs as we see it today. That's a massive imperative for the community and really hits home hard. We've largely escaped the scale of bleaching that has been seen on the Great Barrier Reef, but we're certainly not immune, and this is the outlook for this coming season. So we're certainly keyed towards those large-scale global challenges in terms of global sea surface temperatures and local sea surface temperatures, but also those local stresses that we've been talking about. Some indications of some of the threats that we're facing in Ningaloo. So obviously we have the climate change effects on ecosystems, but we have a lot of effects on communities as well. So we're increasingly worried about the health impacts, the impacts on infrastructure, the impacts in terms of our utilities and emergency response capacity. There's a lot there about our physical impacts, visitor pressure, fishing activity, which is the bread and butter of the national parks, Department biodiversity conservation and attraction, which is where the Chief Resilience Officer position is based. And we also see some of those interesting challenges like proposed development and demographic changes. That looks like a really nice, neat list and potentially a way that we can attack some of those issues by dealing with those in turn. When you actually map that out, it looks something like this in terms of the interconnected nature of all of those different threats and challenges. This isn't for you to understand and to comprehend, but it does pull out some nice little parallels. So if you actually identify which of the are the generally ecological parts of that network and which are the social aspects, you can see how interconnected they are, and it just highlights how important it is to take that integrated approach to management. In terms of what we're doing, it's not really all that different to traditional strategy development. So we're going through that process of having steering committees. This is particularly a community-led consultative committee that guides the whole process. We're going through literature reviews, we're doing assessments, and in this case a resilience assessment, and going through extensive stakeholder engagement. The difference here is that instead of just stakeholder engagement where we have a defined set of management actions that we've decided that we'd like to implement and we're getting feedback, we're actually going out to the community in a really generative sense to say, what are the values that you see of the reef? What are the key threats and challenges, and how do we actually want to move forward as a group? And that invites a lot of innovation, invites a lot of empowerment for the communities. We're also commencing an economic valuation of the reef, which we see as a really important component in order to have those really nuanced conversations about development and the trade-offs between development, fisheries, conservation, protection, giving the reef a voice in those conversations and a credible voice is going to be really important for us. We talked about some challenges and going back to a lot of what Lizzie was speaking about before. So we do have a huge amount of data for Ningaloo. It's well on the map for researchers, and we have a lot of research activity from a number of very prominent research institutions within Australia and internationally. We've got long-term monitoring up and down the coast from a number of agencies, including internally. What that tells us is a very good idea of what's happening in terms of the trends in those keystone species like turtles, like corals, like seagrass. What it doesn't tell us is some of those functional relationships, and it's somewhat blind to the mechanisms behind that change, and that's really what we need to understand if we want to start to move towards those resilience-based management approaches. So we really need to understand what the questions are, what the key questions for management are, and how the research community can start to answer those questions in a really applied and practical sense, and also a very responsive and timely sense. Sorry, this is slightly skewed in terms of the font, but this is talking about the difference between process and outcome focus when we're talking about actions. So at the moment, just to give you an example, we're looking at doing coral trials for restoration within Ningaloo. It's the first time it's been done in Western Australia in terms of corals. We've done seagrass before, but we've never really done this kind of restoration. In order to do that, we're going to really need to do some sort of assessment of our restoration needs across the whole reef area and develop some sort of decision support system for how and where we intervene and what the triggers are to those interventions. We're going to need to do a review of all the legislation and regulations about what governs our ability to put things into the water. We're going to need to, at some point, develop a departmental position on restoration and on climate change, which has been lacking in the past and is a significant internal institutional barrier. Once we actually get that departmental position, we need to do assessment and permitting approvals. We need to establish some sort of monitoring program and engage with best practice restoration programs around the world to learn from them. At the end of all that, we might get to the point where we can put in some trial restoration methods. The point is, when we're talking to stakeholders, both internal within the department and external within the community, this is really all that they care about. They want to understand what is the on-ground practical application of resilience. What are those things that we can really get behind, whether it's cloud seeding, whether it's shading turtle nests, whether it's dune rehabilitation or trial restoration. what I would contend is that the resilience aspect and the real things that actually build resilience is this whole process that comes beforehand. Because regardless of what you end up with, whether it's a trial of restoration that works or not, or different types of trials, that whole process of putting into place the systems which seed success and slightly moving the department towards systems of adaptive management, that actually makes it easier for you to start to adapt to change regardless of what that change ends up being. There is also a large challenge around getting the messaging right, and this has been brought up in a number of contexts throughout the day. When we talk about resilience, it's a very crowded and noisy space. There is resilience in terms of disaster risk management, there's personal resilience, there's well-being, there's resilience in terms of ecological and social aspects. And when you talk about resilience, this is generally what's in people's heads. It's a very fuzzy concept, it's a buzzword, and to a certain extent, it's a bit like sustainability, where it means many different things to many different people. So getting the messaging right and cutting through all of that and engaging with people really takes a fine-tuning of the message that we're putting out there. These are some of the ways that we're doing that. So this is firstly about the call to action. So coral reefs globally are facing existential challenges, and we need to be upfront about that. Saying that climate change is of a huge scale and an unprecedented challenge, and therefore we need to do novel things like resilience approaches, that's not necessarily a logical leap for people. Why do we actually need this novel approach, this innovative approach? Because of climate change. And so it's stepping through those things like, well, we're not really sure how reefs are actually going to respond and react. There may be other shocks and stresses as part of a complex system that we don't anticipate, and many of these factors aren't actually addressable at a local scale by local managers, that we're talking about global things. So therefore, because of all that uncertainty, we need approaches which are flexible and which are adaptable, and resilience actually provides some sort of approach to getting to that place. One thing I really want to emphasise is that we don't want to overpromise what we can actually achieve. Firstly, because we don't want to get into a situation where people are lulled into a false sense of security, that we've all got it covered and we don't need to actually act anymore. But also because in order to achieve some of these things, we're going to need to do some quite ambitious things, and we're going to need to think about the fact that reefs are going to bleach and reefs are going to have huge effects that we can't actually mitigate. Resilience actually provides a way around that if we start to think about the system a bit more broadly. So we're thinking about livelihood diversification. So our particular towns like Exmouth and Coral Bay, which are wholly dependent on tourism, which is related to the reef, how can we actually diversify the livelihoods out? So we focus on alternative tourism, or we focus on different types of livelihoods to support that community through the times when the reef is bleached and it's recovering, and the media is saying don't come to Ningaloo because there's nothing to see. We need to make sure those communities are strong, those economies are strong to support them through those times. This is one of the slides that we often use. What makes resilience different? A differentiation slide. And this slide changes every time that we use it. So this is particularly a community-facing version of this slide, where we actually emphasise the fact that resilience is proactive and it's empowering. So it's a really good news story and it's a really empowering message in what is often a disempowering environment when we talk about climate change. It's adaptive and it's also systemic by design. So we're talking about giving the community and organisations a voice in ecological management where they've often been cut out in the past. And this is particularly in Western Australia, the ability to get out onto the reef, the ability to camp on the beaches is a very fundamental part of the value system there. They've been doing that since they were kids. Their fathers and their grandfathers and their families have been there doing the same things that they're doing. So this is a value system for them that we actually need to be bringing them into the conversation to give them that empowerment and that voice. And it also brings out the TO aspects of the fact that this is very aligned with those traditional principles of country management. This is all going to be quite familiar to the people in the room, but breaking down what actually sets apart resilience and resilience approaches to business as usual practices or standard management practices. So stepping people through these resilience concepts, which are so familiar to us, is actually really enlightening for people, and particularly frame the early conversations around resilience and put them into a very innovative and novel mindset where they're not necessarily thinking about the way that things have been done in the past, but stimulating them to think about how we can interact and form novel approaches in the future. I didn't want to just speak about some of the challenges, so I did want to speak about some of the opportunities that we see resilience providing, particularly in the context of Ningaloo and particularly in the context of Parks Western Australia. So firstly, we see it breaking new ground in adaptive management and collaborative governance. So this is a new space for us in terms of shared responsibility for management among actors which haven't necessarily had the greatest relationship in the past. However, it's not just very new, very novel stuff. We need to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the core activities of parks and reef managers have been to build resilience in the past. It just hasn't been called that. So resilience really provides a framework to pull together all those existing actions and coordinate them under a banner of action, of management, of funding. There's a huge potential for learning within other WA parks and global reefs, and this is a really important driver internally for our organisation to say that this is not just one project. This is actually a pilot that can be used by other examples, other parks throughout the state and learn from. If we didn't have that opportunity and if we didn't make that argument, we would not have traction internally. So shared learning is a huge part of our internal authenticity. It really does provide options and hopes for the future. And you see it in the community's eyes when you start to talk about this sort of stuff, where you don't just stop at saying climate change is a huge existential issue. You actually say, and this is what we can do about it. We have a very engaged population within Exmouth. We have a population that's focused around marine areas. They've moved there because they love the reef, and they continue to come every season because the reef is so important to them. Harnessing that and harnessing the high levels of community concern in order to give them a voice and a role in management is a huge opportunity for building bridges within the community that extends beyond reef management. These connections and these networks actually provide resilience to the community far beyond just the ecological. And the last is a license for innovation through inclusion. So the only way that we're going to get really innovative ideas and buy-in and engagement from those groups is by including them at a very early stage in the program. So unless we give them that opportunity, we're going to miss out on a lot of really interesting ideas from very different corners of the community. And I think those different novel ideas are going to be very contextual and very related to the different institutions and actors in each of those systems. That's all I wanted to say. We're very excited to be part of this really important global initiative and excited for the next 9 months of strategy development.